about doing research or funding research per se. So that's another important point of clarity. So we're going to divide this into two parts. The first part is the logistics of the award, the nuts and bolts of it, and then part two is what do I perceive a strong application looks like against the criteria of the award, which we'll cover a bit in part one and a lot more in part two. So the logistics, where does it sit? Well, it sits between getting your PhD or MD and the next step. Okay, whatever that next step is. Now, you'll notice there that there's an asterisk, which I'll talk about in a minute, and it says submitting for exam. So the criteria for entry to the DSE is you must have submitted your Viva submitted your PhD, MD, etc. For examination, i.e. you must be getting ready for your Viva, but you must have been awarded your PhD, MD by the time you start your DSE. The star is to say that professional doctorates need to contact the programme team before they begin applying to see if the professional doctorate is eligible within the programme. Some of them are, and it's largely done on working out the equivalents, etc. And they are quite idiosyncratic professional doctorates from university to university and also individual to individual. So have a conversation, have it early, don't have it the day before the deadline. So why does the DSE sit there? Well, it sits there historically because there was always a gap, and the gap could be in either skills that you needed to gain. For instance, you haven't done any epidemiology, and you need to get some skills in that for the next phase of what you're doing, or you haven't done any clinical trials and you need some learned experience or experiential learning in those, or you need some developmental work. For instance, you haven't had particular large amounts of leadership experience or helping prepare research teams, etc. Okay. So the gap could be in either skills or development from finishing your PhD and being a strong and credible candidate with a strong and credible idea for further funding at a postdoctoral research fellowship stage. So really think of the DSE as development and skills, i.e. development of career, development of skills, to make you a stronger candidate to fit in the missing jigsaw piece that links all the other pieces together to make you a stronger candidate for an NIHR postdoctoral fellowship award, that type of thing. The award will fund a contribution to salary costs, conference costs, training and development costs, support and mentorship. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about that in a few more slides. What's it supposed to do? So why do we invest this money? And I say we, I mean the taxpayer through NIHR. Why do we invest this money? Because we recognise there's that gap, and because we realise that people might need a hand to develop in a strategic and purposeful fashion. And that's really key. So this is about strategic and purposeful. It's not about I'd like to do a bit of this because I'm really interested in that. That's fabulous. Or, you know, I'm really interested in a number of things, but they might not be strategic for where I was going to with my next fellowship application, etc. So it's really important that you look at it as a strategic and purposeful stepping stone to your next postdoctoral fellowship or intermediate fellowship, as they're sometimes called. And that could include transitioning. So that could include that you have started off in fundamental bioscience and you have discovered something in fundamental bioscience and you want to take that into a clinical trial, and that then sits in NIHR's remit. Clinical trials, obviously, most of them do. Some of them maybe sit a little bit further towards MRC, but let's say it does. And you need some experience in clinical trials and working with industry, then the DSE would be the place that you could apply to try and get that. But it has to be a strategic and purposeful fashion, and you have to outline very clearly how the DSE is going to build you to a better place, a stronger and more credible proposition for a postdoctoral fellowship or further funding in the postdoctoral period. Experienced or established researchers are not ineligible, but so if you're several years post your PhD, if there's a really sensible reason, contextual factors, etc. for that, then you would not be ineligible, but you have to justify why you're that far past your PhD, MD, etc. in your narrative, and it has to be understandable. And again, if you're not certain, ring the program team. And also you can consider the Senior Clinical and Practitioner Research Award as well, which is obviously a research funding vehicle for fellowships. And I'm not going to talk a lot about that because I'm not involved in that. Eligibility, we've touched a little bit on this. You've got to essentially have completed your relevant pre-registration training. I suppose to a certain extent, the people that might impact is someone who has done a PhD alongside their undergraduate career, but they are slightly in the minority. You need to have an English host, higher education institute, National Health Services, or publicly funded health or social care provider, including the third sector. So it's quite a broad church that we work within there. And as I said earlier, you must, by the time the award starts, have been awarded your PhD or MD. So really, really important that you look at that. And we'll talk about timelines in a moment because there's some really decent timelines that you can work within for the DSE. Can we do clinical practice alongside it? Yes, you can, but we don't fund that. So if you want to do 50% clinical and 50% DSE, you can do that. But the 50% DSE will be funded, as the name suggests, by the DSE, and the 50% clinical won't be funded. So you would have to negotiate with whoever funds your clinical activities for you to continue doing that clinical practice, and the two can come together in your salary. Okay. It will fund specific targeted exposure. So, for instance, if there was something really specific that you needed to observe, that was relevant to your next piece of research. So that might be a bit of scoping work to understand how certain sites work, or certain potential sites work for a future clinical trial in X or Y, because they happen to be, the best in the country, and you want to involve them in your next piece of research. Or it might be that you need to look at how another institute in the UK or wider afield run a particular piece of research or team, and there's some experiential learning from that for you. So how long can you have it for? Well, if you had 100% whole-time equivalent, you could have it for 12 or 18 months. 24 months is available for a health and care professional occupation only. So that's a group that includes nurses, midwives, allied health professionals, health scientists, pharmacists, social care, etc. And the reason for that is because historically there have been less opportunities for health and care professionals to potentially be involved in research. And also the 24-month duration would also be available if you were transitioning between research areas. So I gave you the earlier example of fundamental bioscience into clinical trials. But again, have a conversation. As I started the presentation off, and I know some of you are late, Tom Chipitsky is here, who's our program manager. It's very worth your while, if you have specific queries, to ask those queries before you start putting pen to paper or fingers to keyboard, and checking whether or not you are truly eligible or not. So if in doubt, ask. You can take it part-time, between 50 to 100%, which you kind of covered in a minute ago. So for instance, if you want to do some clinical practice, if you felt you only needed 50% of your time for 12 months, you would then go to 24 months where you did 50% DSE, 50% clinical practice. Okay. Again, if you're going to do those sort of arrangements, make sure it's really clear. Make sure the person who's writing your host institute support statement knows what you're doing and supports it, and clearly outlines their support for it and specifies that they are supporting for it, so that all of your narrative, all of your justification flows nicely together, and that someone who doesn't know you from, Adam or Jane, can understand what you've done, what you want to do, why you want to do it, where you're going with it, and that your host institute is supportive and understands the obligations that they have within developing your career. What does it fund? We touched a little bit on this earlier. Salary time for training and development, so enhancement of skills and development. Therefore, it will pay for some training and development. That might be in the form of courses. That's not an issue. But also think about, when you do a course, how useful is a course if you haven't done some experiential learning around it? So is taking one from my own career, is a regression course very helpful? Yes, but if you don't then use it repeatedly, you'll probably lose it and you won't remember it. So you might want some experiential learning with some data sets that are relevant to do that. So you might say, well, I'm going to go and work with this team who are doing this very big piece of research that involves regression, and I'm going to work with them as well. And that's that carefully thought through continuity of training and development that you need. And then mentorship. This is different to supervision, because if you're coming direct from your PhD or your MD or other doctorates, you're used to having supervisors who are there to guide and support and try and keep you in the right direction for your PhD or MD. Mentorship it can be something different, and often is something different in the postdoctoral phase. So it might not be your PhD supervisors. That's not to say it has to not be your PhD supervisors, but equally, you should be looking at, what do I need for the next stage of my career? That's not to say you should jettison your PhD supervisors. I've worked with mine for many, many years and still continue to do so, and love working with them. But you might need something a bit different. You might need someone who's got a wider network in a different place with access to different skills and different patient cohorts, or has done a career path similar to the one that you want to take, and can give you externally based advice. And that would be, again, part of a compelling narrative that you could present. So in detail, what it funds is on the screen, but what you're trying to do is develop as a leader, develop your career, develop your skills. You're trying to strengthen your next funding application, and you need to spell out what you think that next funding application is, so that we can understand whether what you're saying makes a coherent story towards that. You could be potentially coming from a transition back from research to academic career. So you might be coming back from, say, an industry post into an academic career. But again, you would need to buy in with the HEI or whoever you're going to work for. And you could be looking to gain expertise in knowledge mobilization or implementation science with industry. And you can work with industry and undertake a DSE sort of aimed at entrepreneurship and commercial working. Key thing to say is it doesn't fund PPIE, or what's now known as working with public and communities. So it wouldn't fund you to do a public and community group on, in my field, experiences of facial pain that might mean that people were less likely to engage in clinical trials. But it would fund something if you needed to develop some skills in that area. So if you weren't particularly skilled in running groups with public and community and working in groups to facilitate everyone's involvement, then you might be able to put in some training in respect of that. But you would also need to explain where that was leading you to, because that might be leading you to doing some further work with public and communities, leading ahead of your next funding application. So in that example, I might say I needed my training. I need some training in how to facilitate these groups so that I get the best out of them. And then when I finish my DSE, I'm going to have a 6-month period to write up and construct my next application. I'm going to have a 3-month period, and in that 3-month period, which is outside of the DSE, I'm going to do the working with people and communities so that I can understand how I best facilitate their involvement in facial pain trials. When can you do it? So there are 3 submission deadlines. They're in bold. So you submit in November, March, or July, and then they would get reviewed as on screen. And the start dates would be between April and July, August and November, or December to March. And they're all relevant to the competition that you put in. So if in competition 3 you submit in July, you could start between December and March. So the reason I put these up on screen, because I appreciate it's like watching paint dry, seeing that type of thing, is because it's really important. Again, this is all about strategic, purposeful development. So you need to sort of do a backwards timeline and think about, where am I going in the future? What funding pot am I going for my next piece of research? What does that piece of research look like? When would I be a credible, strong candidate for that application? When will I have my ducks in a line, if you like? And then work back from there sequentially and go, okay, so where do I need to start my DSE? What does that mean when I finish my DSE? Am I going to try and construct my application whilst in the DSE, or whether or whilst I'm not? Okay. One thing I think I forgot to mention as we went through, because we're about to move on to part 2, is also don't forget about the pre-application support fund, which is a sort of 12-month fund that allows you to develop things ahead of a DSE, and you could have that ahead of a DSE and apply for a DSE whilst you're in that. I'm not going to talk a great deal about that, but we can come back to it in the later, because it's not part of the DSE. It's a separate pot of funding to help people get more credible for various different applications, including the DSE. So again, think about whether you've got quite the clear picture that you want for your DSE or not. So what does a strong application look like? Well, you've probably heard me talk about coherent credible, compelling, and well justified a lot through the first few slides. And that's not by chance, because that's all of the things that this needs to be. It needs to be crystal clear. It needs to not have continuity errors in it. So don't say one thing in one place and then contradict it in another. It needs to be constructed rather than written. So you need to build it in collaboration with people, get feedback and revise it a number of times, so that you have a really clear idea of what you're trying to do and why, in terms of your career development and your skills development. And the reason for that is that someone who doesn't know you at all will be reviewing this, and they need to understand exactly what it is you do, and where you are wanting to go. The panel is multidisciplinary, so it has all different healthcare professionals and a number of different methodologists on the panel, and a lot of the clinical academics on the panel are also experienced in different methodologies as well. So it will be assigned to people who understand your field, and we do look at contextual factors extremely carefully. So please don't leave that box blank. If there are contextual factors, even if you think they might not be relevant, put them in. The box is there for a reason, because it helps us understand things, so that we can then correctly assess the application. So firstly, a strong application would address areas that we specify on the website. So it addresses all the things that I've talked about previously. So where are you going? What do you need to get there in terms of your skills and development? What are you going to do to target those skills and development, and how will they make you stronger as a researcher, but also a stronger, more credible candidate for your future funding target that you've identified? How have you got to where you're getting to today? What does your trajectory look like? Is it strong? If it isn't strong for contextual reasons, tell us about the contextual reasons. How does that line up to where you're going in the future? Is it believable? Is it ambitious enough? Is it aspirational? Or is it unbelievable because it's just too big a jump? So again, think about, we want ambitious, we want aspirational, but it has to be feasible in the time frame and against the backdrop of what you've done so far. Obviously needs to fit NIHR's remit, and it obviously needs to have strong mentorship and placement and organizational support. Then it might also consider, if appropriate, the following, which are the current strategic areas of interest that are on the website, and these will be of no surprise to you if you've looked at the award. We're particularly interested in areas of working with industry, entrepreneurship, knowledge mobilization, etc. We're interested in big data, we're interested in clinical trials, and we're also interested in helping developing practitioner academic careers along the lines of as I've described, so skills enhancement. All of the first two slides of this section have to be set in the context of who you are, what your needs are, what your capabilities are, what support you need, and then also what the host institution can provide and what capabilities they have. And that might then influence your mentorship, because that might give you the added value from your mentorship. So for instance, if your host institute is prepared to support you to develop this new thing, but doesn't have experience in that new thing, the mentorship might give you the experience in the new thing to bring it back to the host institution. And the added value might be that that's a really niche thing that actually we do need more capacity within clinical academia or life sciences. And then you can then build that at your host institution. And also it's set in the relevant field or discipline context. So again, we ask about your field, your discipline, your methodological background, because we want to know and because it's relevant to what you're doing. So if it so happens that your area is extremely short of academics or extremely bereft of opportunities, then don't be afraid to state that in the contextual factors and paint the narrative and the justification for us. We will probably likely have people in your methodological field or your discipline or your specialty, but it doesn't harm to outline that. We need to understand. So it needs to be this story, this narrative that explains to us who you are, how you've got there, where you want to go, and how you're going to get there. And then within that narrative, be compelling and well constructed and well justified. It's then assessed on the criteria that are on the website, and that QR code takes you to the full list of assessment criteria. There are no hidden things here. They're all there. You can see how it all works. And unsurprisingly, I've already sort of talked about the fact this is on the 3Ps: person, place, and project. The project doesn't quite translate to DSE because it's not a project, but it's your kind of plan, if you like, of what you're wanting to do. So it's person, place, and plan rather than project, but it's the 3Ps that I know people talk about for fellowships in general. So it's where are you wanting to go? What's your commitment to that? Is where you want it to go part of what NIHR needs to do, and what the NHS needs, and what policy needs, and what government needs, etc., what the public need, and where you're going to go with what you're going to do with the DSE, and how your training and development gets you there. And then there's a very careful look at what you're asking for your training and development program, the quality and the relevance of that. And I touched a little bit about that earlier. It's very helpful to do courses, and I would encourage you, if you need one, do one, but also how you're going to get experiential learning in that. And that's kind of why a lot of people apply to the DSE for some exposure to clinical trials, because it can be difficult to understand how the various different logistical parts or bureaucratic parts of clinical trials add together, and then actually how the trial functions through its life course. And people say, well, I actually want to work with this clinical trials unit, and I want to work on this particular trial because this trial is actually relevant to my area, and I'll get a lot of learning from that. But I also want to do this course in particular design of trials or analysis of trials, and that's perfectly fine. And it's not all about trials. Again, it could be about industry. It could be about, I want to go and work with this industrial partner. They've given me a letter of support. The reason I want to do that is because I'm developing this new med tech, and this new med tech, this particular industrial partner is extremely keen on it. We've got the intellectual property, the IP protected, do agreements with them. I want to go and work with them for 2-3 months so that I understand their systems. That's going to help me construct my next funding application because I'll understand their systems better, and understand how research can fit their systems, and also how that will then flow into the future funding application, fellowship, etc. And then we also assess you on site and support, which we've talked about already. I'm not certain that my tips will come as much of a surprise, given what I've said so far, because I've tried to be fairly consistent throughout this. You must construct it rather than write it. Do not sort of slam it down on paper within the last couple of weeks, because undoubtedly at that point there will be a continuity error, or it won't be particularly compelling, or it won't be particularly clear. So construct it over time. Think about how you're going to do it. Where do you place it strategically? Look at the deadline dates, apply to the one that's most relevant to you and most appropriate for you. Look at previous applications that you host, if your host keeps them, or contact previous award holders. There's a phrase in the Northeast that I'm sure people are aware of: don't be a shy Ben. If you can see a previous award holder and they're at your university, the worst they can say is no. Drop them a line and say, is it possible to see your application? The application form has changed recently, so if it's within the last couple of years, it would be more beneficial to you. But the overall nuance and premise of the award hasn't changed a great deal, other than the fact that we opened it to anyone who's working within the higher education institutes, NHS, social care. You don't have to put your holding NIHR funding when you apply for it. And think about realistic timeframes. This is really, really important. Don't try and squash things in when it doesn't work, because that will be picked up on. Some things are feasible in short timeframes and some things aren't. So don't try and make something that really isn't feasible in a short time frame fit a short time frame. Think strategically and purposefully. Touch a little bit on the top one. Make sure that what you're telling, the story, the narrative, is consistent, clear, and continuous. So you will revise this thing. Everyone does, section by section, back and forward, but always at some point read back through from the start to the end. I know that sounds like a ludicrously obvious thing to do, but you will spot errors when you get clear daylight between you and having looked at it. So the way I would approach that is I would write it all several times over, revise it several times over, then get a fresh pair of eyes with a sort of 2-week deadline. I would have given them a notification that, would they mind helping for 2 weeks? And then after that 2 weeks, I'll get it back from them. And then I would then have a clear set of eyes and be able to hopefully see more of the wood for the trees. Your orchid or ORCID needs to be up to date. Please be very careful with it, because there are permission settings on it. I'm not going to try and get into the technical details, but you need it so that everyone can, it's set to visibility for everyone. Check the instructions on ORCID, make sure it's there, and make sure it's readable and clearly outlines your career and its trajectory, because that is your kind of selling your wares page that will be linked to and will be looked at by the review panel. So firstly, if we can't see it, i.e. the visibility settings aren't right, that's not a great start. So make sure it's the settings are visible to all, and then also make sure that when you read it with a fresh pair of eyes, that it makes chronological or logical sense, because having done ORCID recently myself, there's nothing wrong with it, but it can load things up in a very strange order, because you put things in little kind of pop-up windows, and then it loads it into various different sections. So just read it from the top down and just think, would each section be readable on its own? Does it make sense on its own? Is there any more context I can provide within the constraints of the ORCID? This is you selling your career trajectory to date. And then always, 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 with all funding, think about the added value that you are bringing with the application. What's the extra thing that the taxpayer or the public purse or NIHR is getting from funding this DSE for you? And is that in the form of how well supported your host is, or further benefits that you might bring? You might be developing a work group, for instance, because you need a work group or a guideline development group. You might be developing that as part of the DSE without convening it, but getting that networking in place, because you're going to need that for your later work, etc. So and that would be of added value, because that would be something national that would work later in years, as well as right there and then for your DSE. So think about added value that you can bring, and bring that out in your application if you can. There are a couple of examples on the website, and they're really good examples. We chose them specifically. There's one that works with industry, and one that was developing skills, and they're from a varied background, the two applicants. So have a little look at those. They will give you ideas, but also look through the previous funded DSEs. They're available publicly in the online databases. And worst case scenario is you get no response, or sorry, I don't feel comfortable sharing my application with you. If you approach those individuals and ask your host institute whether or not there are examples that from previous years that they're able to share with the permission of the person who wrote the original application. So wrapping up, so we've got time for some questions. In conclusion, pick the most suitable submission time. That's why I put them up on the screen. Think about that. Then construct it, don't write it. Think about the clarity of why you're wanting to do this, why it's going to take you where you want to go, why you want to go there, what's the value of going there for you, and what's the added value of that from the point of view of the DSE. Think about how you're going to be supported in getting there, because academic and clinical academic careers are challenging. They are, ups and downs on the roller coaster of life, as life is, and therefore you want some strong mentorship that's specific to support you. One of those mentors might well be your PhD. I still have that now, and I'm, a professor at Newcastle University, and I would still talk to one of my PhD supervisors who hasn't retired as yet about things that are challenging me from an academic point of view, and get your mentors involved in the construction. Get them to give you some feedback and things. It's a good way of testing whether they're going to engage with you as a mentor. And the bottom line, and that's why Tom's here as well, is to talk to the program team or the program manager if you have queries. Don't sort of sit and worry about something. Actually ask the question, ask it early, so that you can do something with the information that you are given. And that's it. Thanks very much. Happy to take some questions.
I think we'll just, sorry.
Can't hear you, Amy, if you're talking to me at the moment. Oh, hi, Dave.
Hi, apologies, my computer, I thought it was absolutely brilliant, thank you. My computer's just gone a bit haywire, Cheers. So
I know the feeling.
As I said, I think that was a really, really good overview of what I think is a very important scheme. And there are a couple of things I was just going to clarify with you, and apologies in between the computer problems. So I was involved in it in the early days, and we always used to talk about it as bridging with a purpose. And I always thought that was quite a useful line.
Fine. Yeah.
Sorry?
Yes, absolutely fine. It is bridging with a purpose. I would agree.
Yeah. But in the early days, one of the things that I felt was not so good about it, it was quite tight. And this was history. So as you alluded to, it arose out of the trials fellowships, which were very good, but very narrow.
Yeah.
And you used to see some in trials, but also some in health economics. But it was quite narrow. And then the other thing that was quite tight was the scheme that you came from, and in particular, time since NIHR funding. And I got the sense from you that that's all become a bit more flexible now, and it's much more about you explaining why it makes a difference. Is that right? If so, I think that's very important.
Yeah. I think the reason I don't talk about bridging with a purpose is that I think sometimes, as we are all a human, people hear the word bridging and then don't hear with a purpose at the end of it. I like the phrase, but if they forget about the with a purpose, then you end up with a less fulsome application because someone sees it as I've got a gap, and my gap is actually my salary between postdoctoral, between PhD and the next phase, and that's not what this is for. So, and I think I've made that clear. But I think what we did do is, because I've been involved in the application since its initiation in 2019 under Wendy Baird as the previous chair, and I was deputy chair as well, and it's evolved continually because of kind of market demand, if you like, and our appreciation of the market. So when we've had feedback, we've acted on it. So that's why you don't have to hold or have held an NIHR funding to have your application there. We've got a broader area, and if you of interest, and as long as you construct the justification is good, then and you are credible and strong, then yes, we would look to try and help fund it. I think if you think you're not quite fitting any of the pigeonholes that you have to have, because you've got to have kind of boxes to put things in, then ask the question of the program team beforehand. And if the program team can't answer it, they will talk to me and the panel, the deputy panel chair, so that we can come back to you, because this is about supporting people to progress.
So just for everybody, I think that's a really, really important point, is that it is for you to define what the skills are that you will gain through this and how they will help with your career. But there is no pre-requirement for it to be in particular areas. And I think that therefore, but it makes it more important if it's marginal, just to talk to people before you put too much effort into it.
And just to state the obvious, because this recording is being recorded, if it were in animal research, it wouldn't be eligible. And that's nothing to do with animal research, but that's just not in the remit of NIHR within this scheme. So just to be clear, if it's biological modelling, that isn't going to happen. If it's I've done biological modelling, I've got this new compound, and this might be the next best thing since sliced bread for this condition, and I want to become working with a commercial partner, I've got the intellectual property done, and I'm going to go for a phase 2 trial. That's close to remit, because obviously EME will cover that. So that would be one where I'd have a conversation, and if you listen to that description, we would have to think about that and come back to people.
And historically, what NHR has always loved is pull through, that a scheme leads to another scheme, which leads to another, and as Justin alluded to, things like the EME program, your big phase 2 trial program where people have learned skills and got on. Just in that regard, obviously people will be aware of the EME Advanced Fellowship, which is also one of the newer schemes, which brings together an EME grant with an advanced fellowship for people who want to be trialists in the future. And Newcastle has been very successful with that. We've had 3 of them in the 2 rounds. But this is about you being a PI in a trial, and so therefore that's a situation which trial experience through something like DSE might be incredibly useful.
No, I would agree. And I think that's also knowing where you're going. And that was a big part of what I was saying, is look at what's available for you at the postdoctoral level in NIHR, and work out where you're wanting to go. And for instance, you might say, I want to go and do an HTA trial, and that is feasible. We've seen people do that from, not from necessarily from a DSE, but from, say, a doctoral fellowship with NIHR, and they've done some skills development, and then they've gone on to do that, and that would work as well. I think the key thing is that understanding of where you want to go, that strategic thinking, that purposeful decision making. A couple of questions in the chat that I'll come to in just a sec. Tom, was there anything you wanted to add to what I've said, or correct me on anything that I've overstepped a mark on?
No, I think that's all correct, all right. It's as you said, we've developed the scheme a lot since it first started. So things that we often get queries about are the matched funding, which we don't require anymore. We haven't required that for a while. And the training and development, so that should be bespoke to you. We do have the strategic themes that the NIHR want to encourage, but if that's not what fits with where you need to go for your next steps, then it doesn't have to be within that. And you can have more than one within that, but it should be a training plan that's going to get you to your next steps. I think in the application form, we have that research area of interest, which is really important for framing your training and development plan, what you're going to do next, so the committee can understand how the training and development plan feeds into that for their assessment.
Yeah, and I think that's critical. You know, if you want to do something, tell us why, explain why, make it really clear to people who won't necessarily be in depth in your field. And I think that answers one of the questions in the chat. And if it does, I'm not mentioning names from the chat because I'm not sure if they're just visible to me or not. You know, make sure you understand what you want to do, why you want to do it. Tell us that so that we understand. Another question in the chat that I'll just pick up is in respect to that, contextual factors are important. So for instance, I myself have just put something into NIHR, and the contextual factors, I explained that dentistry, which is where I'm based, is a very under-researched area. There are limited specific funding applications. There is a diminishing and not very big in the first place clinical academic workforce. And I've put that in there to explain the context behind what I'm doing. And I'm a professor in that. And people would look at me and go, oh, isn't he marvelous and successful because he looks like a swan on the top, yet his legs are going a million miles an hour below. And I've exactly put the same thing about leadership and teaching loads and things like that are relevant, not necessarily teaching loads for me, but other things that pull on your time. So if there are contextual factors and you feel they are relevant, put them in. We will read them. The first thing I read as panel chair after I've read the CV is the contextual factors. And the reason I do that is because I read the CV or the ORCID or wherever it's sitting, and then I read the CV. Then I read the contextual factors, because the contextual factors help me interpret the CV. If you've got 100 publications and you haven't been at work for 2 years for whatever reason, doesn't matter what it was, and someone else has got 100 but has been at work for the same period, then that's a very different thing, isn't it? You know, at simple level. We don't boil it down to those metrics. I'm just giving you a simple example. So, you know, contextual factors are important. If you think they're relevant, put them in. No one's getting downgraded, because we would never do that on the basis of a contextual factor that we don't agree with. Because it's not up to us to agree with something, it's up to us to use it to interpret what you're saying and understand where you're coming from. So if you don't have lots of mentorship, there aren't lots of academics in your own discipline, then that's really important to put down, because you can say, well, you know, I am of this particular occupation, there are 2 academics in the country in that, and they both happen to be my PhD supervisors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look to this other field that's relatively parallel to this person here who's done a lot of really good work, and they're going to give me that external advice that I need outside of the people that I work with in my PhD, that type of thing. There's a question about PhD. So the question is, does the applicant need to have had been awarded or submitted the PhD? So to apply, to submit your application, you must have submitted your PhD or MD. To receive the award, and there is no wriggle room here, to receive the award, you must have passed the exam. So again, this is about being strategic, being chronological, and thinking about timing, because some people don't always pass their PhD vivas. I hope I'm not, you know, killing a tooth fairy or anything by telling people that, but people don't always pass PhD vivas, and it's a big game of chance if you kind of put it in and go, "Ooh, I'm going to pass my PhD viva." I'm not saying you won't, but just think about that and how that would work, and what's your contingency if you didn't have that and pass it, because you know, this is about you asking for up to sometimes a couple of £100,000 worth of public taxpayer money. So, you know, it's an important thing that you're going to do. It's like going, I would have said, like going for a mortgage for a house, which I think is still just about relevant, but house price is kind of doing this. So, you know, it's a big undertaking, and it's something that needs to be constructed and thought through. So happy to take some other questions in the chat or live if people wanted to come on. I think the other thing to say is, which I forgot to say earlier, is the scheme is phenomenally successful in terms of what it does. If you get on the scheme, we are seeing people leverage further research funding at substantial rates of knots. So if you construct a credible, strong, well thought through application, and you get a DSE, the success factor after that is high. And these are awards that go to multiple different types of institutions all around the country. They aren't to whoever you might think of as your first go-to institution as a research centre of excellence. They're from all sorts of places, for all sorts of disciplines, for all sorts of research, and for all sorts of skills. So hence the field is very wide, and it can be extremely deep. So you need to be very clear and very strong and very compelling in what you do.
Just on that note, I think that's a really important point. I mean, so on the EMI panel, the chairs always emphasise the point that we are a funding panel, not a blocking panel, and that the principle is that you wish to support people. We're there for a reason. However, you as an applicant have to help us to help you, and that's where your points about the contextualising factors are so important. Is that don't leave too much for people to have to work out for themselves on the panel. Don't overdo it, but just make it really nice and clear.
The question, and I think the question is the questions arrived in the chat. I'll take this one as the last one because I appreciate people not needing to nip off and things coming to the end. The question is it possible to hook your application into 2 areas or themes for development, e.g. clinical trials and implementation? That very much depends on whether that's overly ambitious or not. If it flows well and you could do it within the time frame, then we wouldn't immediately discount it. But at the same time, are you kind of spreading your jam too thinly on your piece of bread? If you apologies for the analogy, would you be better potentially looking at a pre-application support fund to do something smaller, build that so that you're more credible for the DSE and go for the DSE in a specific area? There's nothing to stop you from going for 2 areas. You will be asked for an area normally of your interest on the application form. So yes, it's possible. But again, it's that whole thing about justifying it, explaining it, making it credible that you can do it in the time frame. Tom, any final points from you? Otherwise, happy to wrap this up.
No, I think you've done a really good job. Just as you say, with the DSE, it's just the application that the committee gets. So make sure that you're telling your story and that the committee can understand where you're going, what your next NIHR funding application is going to be, and how you're going to get there with the training and development plan. It just, because that's all the committee have to go off, you need everything in there. I think Justin's given some really good advice on what to put in, how to do it, but just if it's not in there, they can't assess it.
And it is as simple as that, and it's about that compelling narrative and understanding that narrative. And as Dave has said, we do want to fund people. We really do, because we enjoy supporting people, but we also have to have a justification and a clear justification for doing so, because we are using NIHR money, which by translation is public taxpayer money, and it has to be used to its greatest advantage and get the most added value from that. So you need to think about that as you put the application. It's why I give the analogy of a mortgage, because if you're asking for a couple $100,000, that's a mortgage. So we need to be able to justify that against what you've given us, and we can't make assumptions against what you've given us. It has to be clear and on the page, and that's difficult and it's challenging, because I know the type boxes, etc., but that's why it needs constructing, because you have to whittle it down. Because if you're like me, A, I talk too much, and B, I write way too much. It takes me ages to chop down and chop down and chop down. Dave knows, because he did my mock interview many years ago, and I'll never forget it. Thanks, Dave. But seriously, you've got to polish it, and it's got to be like highly polished. And it can. Some people are brilliant at it. They can slam something down, and it's really good from the start. But for me, I have to work really hard at it, and I have to work well in advance, like 12-18 months in advance. There's no chance otherwise. And that's got worse in recent years, maybe because I'm aging, but also because my consolidated time to write things. So for instance, a full day of writing, that's a rare occurrence because of other leadership roles. So that's a beautiful thing when it happens and is really helpful. But when you get into those circumstances, you need to account for that in your planning as well. Great. Look, lovely to see you all. Thank you all for interacting, and do consider putting DSEs in, but do also make sure that they are compelling, well constructed, clear narratives that we can work with and look at. And we do give good feedback as well. If you weren't successful, we do give you really good feedback, and it is possible to resubmit. There is a kind of timing thing on that, so you would be advised about that if you were unsuccessful. Okay.
Justine, that's been incredibly useful. Thank you so much. I mean, we do these Know Your Funder sessions because we find it so useful to deep dive into a particular funding scheme, and we will share the recording with everybody who's registered. We'll make sure it's on our YouTube channel so that people can come back and look at this. And thank you, Tom, as well. It's really, really very useful. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think if we could just ask well, future applicants, if we can ask the audience if they're happy for the question and answer session recording to go on as well. Dave, I presume you're happy. And I think
absolutely.
Tom and I would be, just because I think that's helpful. I mean, I've done this because Newcastle asked me, but equally we were about to do this for our own website. So we will put this recording up on our own website.
Just for the record, we make that these are open to anybody who wants to join them. We've had a lot of people from other organisations come in. That's absolutely fine. They are there as a service. You know, we're all in the game of helping people to develop their careers. That's why you do it. It's why we do it. You know, and I think in that sense, it's in the spirit of that. So it's not a Newcastle thing.
Right. Lovely. Well, nice to meet you all. Nice to see you all. Hope to see applications soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.